following podcast contains mature language and spoilers. Listener discretion is advised. As I've mentioned in the past, I didn't know how it was going to work when Who's Editing got started. It just got dropped. Nobody knew it was coming. And so like most of the people, I was playing the game that Cisco had laid out of just pitching new series featuring the characters featured in the first issue of Who's Who from 85, I guess it was, 84, whatever it was. The first entry was Abel. So I started with Abel and just started working my way down. Now all the earlier ones were elevator pitches, just like you'd expect from the show. And it wasn't until I got to Apocalypse that you start seeing something else developing. Basically, I decided to use the Apocalypse entry as the springboard for the concept behind the various pitches of basically killing off all the Justice League and shaking up the fourth world pretty radically. And I was essentially channeling a notion I've had for a lot of years, going back till late 90s, early 2000s when I read the black and white. I guess you'd call it like a showcase edition of New Gods proto showcases. They weren't doing their knockoffs of Marvel Essentials yet. I don't even know if Marvel's Essentials were coming out at that point, but I'd read it and it was like, well, where do you go with the New Gods material? Because if it's just Orion versus Darkseid forever, who really gives a shit? We already got that with Star Wars, and that actually came to a resolution as well. So why would we want to just have this endless rotation of Darkseid dies, comes back, Orion defeats him? It's tiresome. I always felt like Kirby had a definitive end for the fourth saga in mind. He might not have known what it was, but I don't think he intended it for it to go on forever and ever like his Marvel creations. And I don't know that it's fair to just keep dragging them on and on and on. I think you can have the fourth world carry on in the same way that Star Wars carried on, very much influenced by the fourth world, but you do need a demarcation point. If you look at Lucas did his trilogy and then he did his prequel trilogy, and those 6 parts are a whole story, and then you're done. That's the end of Lucas's story. Other people could and have done stories that go beyond that point. There's a bunch of people who have done work that takes place prior to that saga. That's all fair, but Lucas got to tell his main story that he wanted to tell. Kirby, to some degree, got to do the same thing. And I don't think it serves the audience or the material to just keep going back to Darkseid versus Orion again and again. And I honestly think that's one of the big problems with all the attempts to do fourth world revivals is they're essentially telling variations of the story that Jack Kirby already told 40, 50 years ago. What's the fucking point? But the reason why I harp on Apocalypse is because giving a taste of an idea that I'd had for the New Gods that will never come to fruition, set up building in a backstory. As the 12th issue of the miniseries, it's the setup for the various pitches. And so as Siskoid continued with the experiment, that probably planted the seed for me to continue to do my little side journey, my side experience in the comments. I never read any stories about the original incarnation of the Bad Samaritan, at least in my recollection. I like the way Jim Aparo drew the character in the Who's Who entry. Just a dude in a suit with sunglasses and a cigarette. My understanding of the character is that he is essentially a bad actor. He's a person who involved himself in Cold War politics and stirred shit, essentially. Seems like a fun idea, far less egregious than most of the goofy stuff that Mike Barr came up with for the Outsiders. What I've been exposed to recently as part of research for the Who's Editing is the Bad Samaritans, the New 52, which you may be surprised is a thing. Well, not like a thing, but like it does exist though. So you're probably aware of the sad joke that was the New Age of DC heroes. I remember when that stuff was coming out, I assumed doom pretty early on, and basically I had a death pool going on to see how long each individual title would last. So the basic premise was that they were going to try to engage artists as though it were still the image age of comics, and they would actually give artists top billing and give them more creative control over a particular launch book to acknowledge the efforts of artists. And I'll be the first to tell you, obviously it's much harder to draw a comic book than it is to write one. Problem is, Image Comics in particular, but comics in the 90s in general, taught most generations of comic readers, mainstream North American I should specify, that the writer is more important to your enjoyment of a comic book. It was something I preached back in the early 90s, and only became more apparent as the decade wore on was that if you follow a writer that you enjoy, you're more likely to enjoy that comic than you are if you follow an artist. I followed a lot of artists in the early 90s. I was definitely a big fan of many of the Image artists. I bought a large number of Image comics in the early days, and I was distressed by how much money I was putting out for material that I just absolutely did not enjoy. Now, that isn't to say that I don't support Image comics. I obviously do if you listen to any of my Spawnometer podcasts or independent comics podcasts. I'm very much not a supporter of mainstream corporate comics, up to a point. I mean, let's face it, this is a podcast about mainstream corporate comics. But the early Image material is pretty hard to get through because they're poorly written and they didn't hire writers back then. It's also one of the reasons why Wildstorm performed much better than the other Image houses, because they bothered to hire the services of people who actually were adept at writing rather than just like getting their high school buddies to write shit. Although Wildstorm certainly did that too. In the early 90s, it was clear that you had a certain baseline for the quality of comic book writing. You had better ones and worse ones, but there's a reasonable expectation of what you were going to get when you bought a comic book in terms of the writing quality. So what really set a lot of comic books apart was the quality of the artwork, how much detail they were going to put in, how dynamic the layouts were going to be. And so the artists obviously became major stars in the early 90s. But the problem is we have a aging fan base in mainstream North American comic books, and the older you get, the more important it is for the story to be good. Obviously, you want to have pretty pictures as well, but the story is the key. And so since about the late 90s, definitely the early 2000s, the writer has just been far more important to comic books in terms of promotional value. I mean, let's face it, artists have only gotten slower as their work has become more involved. And so you're much less likely to get 6 issues of a comic book, much less a year's worth, where a writer could write a full year. That's not a problem. Some of them are going to do it faster than others, but you could reasonably expect that if you buy a comic book, you're going to have the same writer at least until the story is finished, unless there's been a lot of editorial compromise. So DC tried to manufacture a quasi-Image resolution based in this as spin-offs of all things Batman Metal. And so there's a bunch of comic books where they list the artist first, and it's ironic and darkly humorous how few of the artists who launched those books actually stay on those books for any length of time. And one of the finest examples was The Unexpected. Here's a book that was written by Steve Orlando for, I believe, the entire series, which ran about 8 issues, if I remember correctly. And then Ryan Sook was supposed to be the person who launched the title, but he literally didn't even finish a full issue. Kerry Nord had to draw some of the issues, and then later on other artists produced the work. The Unexpected was unexpected. It wasn't a book that anybody had any investment in. Apparently sales were pretty awful if it only made it to 8 issues. And Steve Orlando's a guy who I haven't had a ton of experience with, but he wrote a lot of DC books in the last few years, and none of them seem to be particularly well received. I read his Martian Manhunter relaunch. It was an interesting situation because I didn't hate it, even though he was taking liberties with the character. I just recognized that it wasn't for me and no longer supported it. I bought the trade. I didn't buy the individual issues. It seemed like a sort of thing where I don't know anybody who responded to that. I don't know of anybody who glommed to that particular series. I've actually heard from more people that read the Rob Williams, Eddie Barrows run and are more defensive about that run. I don't know anybody that got particularly excited about the Steve Orlando, Riley Rossmo run. I understand that. I think Ange liked some of the stuff he did on Supergirl, but I might be mistaken about that. Point being, he did a book called The Unexpected, and the book was about a quartet of new or revised heroes. And it really got off on a bad foot because after the first issue, 2 of the 4 characters were killed off. It was, I think, Viking Judge and some blue skin Atlantean dude. I'm going to be honest with you. I flipped through those books, but I couldn't be bothered to read them. I was just looking at it for research, and it just didn't grab me. There was nothing about it that particularly appealed to me. But one of the weird, interesting things about it was that they had a new 52, and I understand that I think the new 52 was no longer a branding that DC was using by the time The Unexpected came out, but also all the shit that's coming out is still new 52 as far as oldies like me are concerned. It's all the same kind of shit. I know that they've made a conscious effort to bring back more of the older pre-Flashpoint continuity, but I think some people are more receptive to that than others. Clearly the mindset of DC Comics still is new 52-ishness, and even though Dan Didio's gone until maybe after Eternal Winter and those bullshit Futures End crossovers they got coming out are done with, I don't know what the face of DC is going to be going further into 2021, but at the start of it still looks very Dan Didio-esque. I mean, even though New 52 started in 2011, let's be honest, for the most part, you had some New 52-ishness as soon as Dan Didio took over full reins of DC Comics, and it just got more Didio-ish as things progressed. So anyway, so the New 52, The Unexpected team, half of them were killed off early on, and they were killed off off specifically by a character called the Bad Samaritan, who was the New 52 version of this concept. And he was essentially Rob Zombie. Cowboy hat and said, yeah, a lot. Maybe, I don't know. I don't even actually read it that much. But he was just sort of like a douchey, satanic force that was trying to take a conceit of MacGuffin from one of the characters and ended up killing the other two characters as an aside. And so the only two that ended up surviving that initial issue were a new version of Firebrand and a new version of Neon the Unknown, neither of which I found particularly compelling. And they managed to get 8 issues out of it, probably in part because they somehow tied all this shit into Hawkman. And also the first arc featured that Sin Eater character that I don't think they call Sin Eater anymore, Aminar Sen, from the James Robinson and/or Jeff Johns and Rags Morales Hawkman War run. And then the last part of it was involving that vampiric monitor that turned up in some of Grant Morrison's stuff around the time of Final Crisis. The story seemed to just be remarkably stupid. It seemed to just be one of those things that went around in circles. Shitty, pseudo-profound meta-commentary on the role of the artist in society is so fucking tedious. But anyway, as a part of that, you had basically Rob Zombie running around causing problems, and then eventually when he is rejected as a faithful acolyte of the vampiric watcher, monitor, whatever the fuck they call those things, he turned on that monitor and teamed up with the surviving members of the Unexpected and Hawkman to defeat this creature. So if you never read The Unexpected, don't. It kind of looks like shit. But I think The Bad Samaritan is one of the less awful concepts to be originated by Mike W. Barr on the Outsider series. There was also a scenario set up in that very first edition that has carried on throughout the volumes, is that I had an idea for Aquaman back in, I guess, early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s. Really, honestly, the germ of it goes all the way back to before Peter David took over the series, like the period between Time and Tide and the ongoing series. It always bugged me that David had teased us with this idea of he was launching that book with Aquaman having a devastating encounter with the piranhas. And that set my brain into a place where it's like, okay, this guy's going to be either ravaged by piranhas or he's going to actually die. And we're going to have this sort of zombie Aquaman. There's so much stuff that comes with that. And then David went the absolute worst way by having some stupid, newly created, short-lived villain push Aquaman's hand into a pool of piranhas so that it gets eaten off and then ultimately replaced by a fucking hook. This is much mocked. I mean, there are fans of it. Shag goes out there and defends it all the time. But I think the broader fan community laughs at that because it's some dumb shit. You know, they gave Aquaman a fucking hook. What the fuck? Captain Hook, motherfucker. I had my notions going back to, I guess, 94 or so. They were expounded upon when I was doing a lot of labor work in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. And I would be working in warehouses and have a lot of time on my hands. And so my mind would wander and I started thinking about like grand schemes for what you could do with superhero characters and the DC universe in particular, since I was still very enamored in that material. And so I had this grand Aquaman idea that would ideally have been like a weekly series that was just setting up a new Aquaman ongoing series, which I wanted Jim Lee to draw, of course, just because he was a guy at DC that would have been able to instill a lot of value in Aquaman that otherwise wouldn't be there when you go after the Jim Calafiors and Marty Eglins of the world, which again isn't intended to slight those artists, but they don't have the commercial appeal of a Jim Lee, for instance, particularly in the early 2000s. And the whole thing was going to be a death and a rebirth, and it was going to address the death of Artie Jr. and the relationship between Aquaman and Mera, which had gotten so toxic when she went mad to try to kill him in the Keith Giffen, Robert Loren Fleming miniseries from the 90s. And it was really going to be something to address like the entire history of Aquaman. And even I was going to try to alter his origins, just a whole thing. It was going to be a big old thing. The problem is Jeff Johns came along, and Jeff Johns did two things. One, he did Darkest Night, which was a variation on a lot of stuff that I wanted to do in that grand Aquaman arc. And then the other part was that he launched a very successful Aquaman ongoing series with Eban Race, not needing to go to the Jim Lee pool. He found a whole other guy who, frankly, I enjoy a lot more. And while I didn't do backflips over his Aquaman series, by the time he had done his Brightest Day, Blackest Night, and Aquaman run, there was nothing that I wanted to do with Aquaman that I was going to be able to do if it ever was, let's face it, it's never going to happen anyway, but, entertain my delusion. And so I basically did a really thin synopsis of that idea for that first volume of Who's Who. And so that sort of set up the idea that the story that I was telling was was going to be an alternate universe. Essentially, the Atlantis omnibus from that volume 1 solicitation copy features the same creative talents that had worked on the 52 maxi series, 50, weekly series. And so again, that establishes where the whole game is going. The timeline in the comments does not match the actual DC Comics timeline, which was somewhat essential because, especially going into the project, I had not followed the DC universe closely in a number of years. I gave the New 52 a shot. I wasn't a fan. I was already very disillusioned with DC throughout the entirety of Dan Didio's time with the company. And I was just plain ignorant about where DC was in the current times. I mean, it's at the point now where I have stopped reading solicitation copy. It used to be for about 30 years, 25, 30 years. I would get previews or advanced comics, and if nothing else, I would read every solicitation blurb for a DC comic book that was in the catalog. I used to do that with Marvel as well. Sometime in the 90s, that started to taper off a bit. In particular, once I stopped being a retailer, because I did feel like as a retailer, I really needed to keep up with what was going on and be able to see trends and see books with potential that I wanted to make sure that I have stocked on the shelves. So even when I was no longer very enthused about reading copy about Marvel Comics, I would still read them for my customers, for my shop, for professional reasons. Once I closed my shop, though, to a large degree, I stopped reading Marvel solicitations. I just skimmed them unless there's something particularly noteworthy, because if I'm only buying for myself, I don't need to commit myself to the Marvel Universe in that way. And eventually the same thing came true of DC. It took a long time. I believe they was probably well into the New 52 before I stopped reading every solicitation of at least the mainstream core superhero solicitations, because to me, it stopped mattering. The DC Universe stopped mattering because it had rebooted for people who were not me in ways that I did not approve of or appreciate, and it just didn't matter anymore. There was no reason for me to do so. And so in that first edition, through the solicitations related to the Aquaman universe, it was me exercising the Aquaman stories I was never going to tell to some degree, and also sort of waving the flag that this was going to be an alternate timeline, which would of course come into play later on. I just want to mention that I love Baron Blitzkrieg, in part because he pulled off an uncommon color scheme and was obviously a Nazi without looking anything like any other goose stepper. There are just so many Red Skull riffs out there. He had a great redesign as simply the Baron in Damage, which is not the greatest series ever, but it's often overlooked. It was a good looking book too. I think Tom Joyner, who's the guy who drew that one? Anyway, it's a good looking book.
Bill Merriman. You sloppy drunk.
Baron Blitzkrieg is basically Nazi Superman, but he's got this bizarro yellow, like orange-ish costume with like sort of fuchsia-ish highlights, like a cape and stuff. A fuchsia Iron Cross basically begs you to do some sort of an LGBTQ closet case thing with Baron Blitzkrieg, but they of course got to get away from that. They had him start running around in yod furs and stuff. The thing about him is he's basically Superman plus Doctor Doom plus Nazis. Obviously, I'm very averse to promoting anything related to Nazis at this point, since we're obviously having yet another racial reckoning here in the United States and really globally. There's just a lot of shitty stuff going on these days regarding immigrants and people of color. But it's hard to deny the appeal of somebody who's this weird looking, who's tied into as provocative a imagery as the Nazis while still not looking really that much like a Nazi. It's weird how he comes in through the back door of Nazism, where he doesn't look like a Nazi, but he's got enough iconography so you kind of get it. But the main thing I think is the Doctor Doom Man in the Iron Mask thing that he's got going on there. It's just very intimidating. It's cool to see like heat vision coming out of those metal eye slats and stuff. He's intimidating and he's extremely powerful. And also, he came out of Wonder Woman stories. People really forget that because he was used heavily in All-Star Squadron. He was one of their easy default villains to make a lot of use out of. I think they made him the guy who killed Red Bee. And of course, me being a child of the 80s, my exposures were through All-Star Squadron and various, Damage. So I probably have an inflated sense of what kind of impact Baron Blitzkrieg had on the DC universe as a whole, because he just hadn't appeared in books that I was reading. But he's extremely powerful and he's interesting looking, so it's hard for me to let him go. Of all the Nazis in the DC universe, he's one of the ones I have the most reservations about letting go of, where really we should be at a point now where we should have turned a corner and just not talk about Nazi anymore. They shouldn't be a thing besides an object of ridicule and just outright hatred. It's okay to hate Nazis. If you are like a hippie peacenik and you don't want to be mad at anybody, you can still totally be mad at Nazis and get that that anger out of yourself, get that aggression that you try to suppress out of yourself and put it onto Nazis because they absolutely fucking deserve it. It would be nice. We're almost a century distant from actual Nazis. I guess the iconography is still relevant to today, unfortunately, though. So if you're going to do something in the DC universe with Nazis, it might as well be with Baron Blitzkrieg. But please fuck him up when you do so. Don't build him up too much. Don't let him go the Red Skull route where you almost lionize him. He should definitely be a shit weasel. Always look to Steven Spielberg and Indiana Jones to know how to handle Nazis. Make them the fucks that they are. Every Nazi should basically be Stephen Miller, and you should just fuck his ass up every chance you get in your imagination, in creative works. Arion. This was a dude that was in the DC Sampler. He got a 2-page spread, and I have a automatic interest pretty much in anything that was in the DC Sampler because it was one of my introductions to the broader DC universe. Perhaps more importantly, though, late in the 80s, I was friends with an Egyptian kid who was not treated well. He suffered through a lot of ethnic stirs. You know, I didn't do anything special with him. He was a nice guy. I was friendly towards him. Apparently that was enough, and he really took to me, and he started doing stuff for me. Like he gave me issues of X Factor, and I wasn't actually a big X Factor fan, but you know, it was really nice of him. And he gave me a little pocket dictionary that I still have with his name written on it. I assume that was supposed to be his copy for him to have his name on it. Really grateful to have it because it's just a nice little memento of this nice fella. And one other thing he gave me that I have a lot of regrets about is an art book of pieces by a painter named Michael Whalen. And this was a guy who did a lot of fantasy and sci-fi paperback covers in the 70s and 80s. It was a neat book with a lot of cool illustrations. And it was through that book that I was introduced to Elric of Melniboné. I've never read any of the books, but everything about the concept of this immortal warrior, not immortal, but reincarnated warrior, this being a particular incarnation, and he has these vampiric qualities. There's a lot of that angsty Morbius stuff about the guy. Basically, I think his sword would steal people's souls when he would fight them and shit. And you know, he's all pale, and it's an ebon blade, and you've got the fantasy guy going nuts with it on the paperback covers. That's pretty much irresistible to a young person, an adolescent. And I've always heard that Arion has a strong Michael Moorcock quality to it. Problem being that it was created and written by Paul Kupperberg. And this is a guy who I know has contributed a fair amount to the Fire and Water podcast, not the podcast, but the Aquaman Shrine, when that was still a going concern. And he seems like a really nice guy, and you know, I don't want to bag on the fella, but you take somebody like Keith Giffen, that's an artist, especially when he's in his mid-80s Munoz period, where I just look at his work and I want to read the story. It just resonates with me and it sucks me in, and I'm totally on that wavelength. Paul Kupperberg is the exact opposite of that. And just knowing that I'm going to have to read a Kupperberg script, I'm just dragging ass the whole fucking way. I just find his stuff really boring. I can't think of a single thing that I read of his that I actively enjoyed. Mostly it's tolerated at best. I just, something about his writing style bores the living shit out of me. And so because of that whole Elric quality, I have a slight interest in Arion. It doesn't hurt that the art, especially in the promo ads, is really good. Jan Duursema was the artist on the series, and usually on the ads she was inked by her eventual husband Tom Mandrake. I know that my buddy Mac is fond of the combination of their two art styles, and I have to agree. I really feel like the sum of Jan Duursema and Tom Mandrake is greater than them as individual artists. Complement each other so well that, given my druthers, I just rather see them combine and produce work as a team rather than as individual artists. And especially on those house ads, Arion looks pretty cool. By the way, I haven't mentioned it. He's an ancient sorcerer from Atlantis. He's popped back up in the modern era. He has that sort of Namor thing going on where he's supposedly a protagonist, but more often than not, he's such a dickweed that he plays as an antagonist, but typically he is on the side of angels, sort of kind at least. His costume's nothing special. He's essentially wearing Superman's suit. He's no Doctor Strange or anything, but because of his ties to Aquaman and to Power Girl, I want to like him more than I do. I've barely read any of his stories, mostly guest appearances. I did read a few issues of his ongoing series before they put me to fucking sleep, but I know I'm never going to commit to reading a series, and so he's always going to be one of those guys who has like mild interest in guest appearances, nothing much beyond that. I'm sorry. I just have no fucks to give for Baron Winters. He just does not interest me in any way. I think this was definitely Marv Wolfman not doing his strongest work. Is definitely an episode of, hey, I worked with Gene Colan at Marvel, and that was great for a bunch of years, even though by the time they were done too much Dracula, it pretty well sucked. And we want to revisit this relationship, even though creatively, I don't think they had a lot to contribute at DC as a combo. But yeah, Night Force, whatever. I'm sorry. I can't get it up for this dude. Joe Kubert drew a fantastic Blackbriar Thorn entry for Who's Who, but it makes my blood boil to think of how little impact he'd had in the DC universe up to that point. There was a real lack of historical context in Who's Who when it came to chasing down these recent characters for entries while leaving series regulars of yore out in the rain to rust. The ease of reference here for writers, artists, and editors meant Thorn kept coming back, but other characters with dozens of appearances remain forgotten to this day. Actually, let's be honest, nobody really remembers Blackbriar Thorn either, but he does pop up on occasion. Atlan. Aquaman has a somewhat tortured history. He was always a Submariner knockoff. I don't think anybody really disputes that. They just try to ignore it as much as they can, because the truth is, while Submariner was the more primal and engaging character, the more successful character upon his initial release, he's one of the early hits the Marvel Comics had before they even called themselves Marvel Comics. And Aquaman was blatantly just a knockoff of that. But simply put, DC Comics appropriated most of what made Namor noteworthy, his regency, his kingdom, all the Atlantis bullshit, that Namor to some degree has become a footnote as a result of that. Aquaman became the more popular character to some degree through force of will, I think. Aquaman was co-created by Mort Weisinger, who was a very powerful editor at DC Comics for decades, and a lot of that power came from lording over people, making unilateral decisions. I think that he had a lot to do with Aquaman managing to continue to be continuously published pretty much in perpetuity within comics, certainly DC Comics. And in the 60s, when they decided that Aquaman was just going to steal every fucking thing, including the wallpaper from Namor, aside from his personality, it kind of worked for them. Aquaman got popular enough to where they adapted him into a cartoon series, and that series reflected the changes made to the series that were appropriated from Namor. A key part of Namor's origin is the fact that he has a mother and a father, and the father is from the surface world and the mother is from the ocean, from Atlantis. That was taken from Namor and given to Aquaman. You have some continuities where Tom Curry or Arthur Curry are more essential to the Aquaman mythos. You have others where he's more minor and they play around with his supposedly true post-crisis parentage of the sorcerer Atlan and a queen whose name escapes me, because she doesn't turn up again until like the Jeff Parker run in the New 52, where Atlan was a recurring character throughout Peter David's run. I think Peter David actually created him. And so Atlan, let's be honest, it's fucking Aryan, okay? It's another sorcerer from Atlantis. Another one of these guys who straddles a line between good and evil, looks a lot like Aquaman, doesn't contribute much beyond backstory for Aquaman and being daddy. So unless you're Peter David and you're building upon your own Atlantis Chronicles, nobody really seems to have a lot of use for Atlan. I personally am a bigger fan of there being a surface world figure that was important to the development of Arthur Curry. The movie reflected that. He was raised by his father on the land, son of a lighthouse keeper, whereas Namor was more focused on his mother, who I believe was named Dorma. It's a mild distinction, but I'll grab onto whatever I can. The fact that Namor has always been oriented more toward the ocean in opposition to the surface world, and that Aquaman has always been oriented toward the surface world in opposition to Atlantis. He, in his mindset, regardless of what continuity, even the period where he was Tarzan of the Dolphins, he's always been the champion of the people who walk on land. And that goes back to his origins, where in the earliest days, in the Golden Age, he was not an Atlantean. He was a regular person who was just given powers that allowed him to interact with the ocean in ways that nobody else can. You can bring in all the mystical bullshit that Atlan brings with him. I've referenced earlier that I had the grand year-long weekly Aquaman story I wanted to tell, and Atlan was a huge part of that. But it's not that I have any particular interest in Atlan. It just worked for that type of narrative. And it seems like Atlan is largely forgotten today as the focus has returned to Tom Curry and has reoriented Aquaman more toward the earliest days of his Silver Age storytelling rather than when he went full bore into the Atlantis bullshit that, let's be honest, most people don't give a shit about anyway. You know, Namor Namor was big in the Atlantis stuff, and that's probably what hurt that character and made him less popular than Aquaman. So it's probably for the best that we pretty much all forget about Outlaw. Outlaw isn't even a thing in the New 52, right? Anybody miss him? I don't really think so.
Gonna make a break and take a fake. I'd like a stinking 18 shake. I like vanilla, it's the finest of the flavors. The 108th Sage. Alan Middleton. Dr. Angie. B-Code Django. Chris Dunford. Chris Lighton. Chris Thompson. DC Tweets. Dear Cashton, who added thanks RSP. Ed Moore. El Romero Mero. Fanholes Podcast. Green Lantern HG. No evil shall escape my sight. The Hammer Strikes. Random geeky stuff. History of comics on film. Hicks, famous influencer. Iowa's Joe Crawford. John is watching cartoons. Kenny Crowley JRKSC, GSF, podcast. Larry. Michael Wagner. Mike at Send Aliens to Me added got it downloaded and ready to roll for work. Milla Dream. MinMX Jeffrey Brown. Randy Caldwell. Ranger Gord. Resurrections, and Adam Warlock and Thanos podcast. Reverend Odell Abner Dracula. Richard G. Robb. Ryan Daly. Sean Phillips. Siskoid. Son of Cthulhu. Time Price the Podcrasher. Trekker Talkin' Wonder Woman, Warrior 4-Piece podcast. We got enough comments on our Wonder Woman 1984 roundtable that we actually had to edit for the first time in a while. Many of these comments will be addressed in yet another roundtable, still involving Frank, but this time with other Wonder Woman fans. Yes, really. Keep an ear tuned to future episodes of Angela's Warrior for Peace podcast. Derek WC said, thanks, I did want to hear what you guys thought of the film. Appreciate the editing time to get out your hot takes. Michael Wagner noted, halfway in. No lies or biases. Had to check my listening speed with a legal machine a few times. Jeffrey Brown 2099 wrote, it's something that makes me look at the two less favorably. Sure, I like Birds of Prey, that is a fun film, and I like Harley, Renee, Huntress, and Black Canary and Cass. But with Wonder Woman I expected better. Funny enough, I am still reading Wonder Woman comics. From hearing how bad this movie was, I only hope that they make the third Wonder Woman movie like Thor Ragnarok. I like that movie. Got me to like Thor. But I doubt that WBDC would want to do that, and I wish Cersei was in WW84. She could have been Loki to Diana's Thor. After halfway reading through Phil Jimenez's run, and seeing the golden armor, I had high expectations for WW.84, but upon hearing the news they are going to fast-track the third movie, I worry about what WB is going to make next with Wonder Woman. But I have so many questions about Wonder Woman, and her place in the DCU. Like her showing up in WW.1, ducking out and doing nothing for WW2 where she could have formed the DCU, hiding during the 70s and then shows up to stop WW3, and then back into the shadows. I have watched and listened to all of the reviews. And I will say I will not sign up to Bomex in order to see this. The whole issues with consent and the non-existent rules about what the Wishing Rock does just frustrated me. I had such high hopes and expectations for this film. Kyle Benning wrote, finally got around to listening today, breaking the episode up into many smaller bits. At one point I had thoughts on something you said, was driving around attempting to get a kid to take a nap, and since forgot what it was I wanted to comment on. I enjoyed everyone's thoughts. Ooh, okay, now I think I remember one thing. Frank's reaction to the contest scene essentially sums up my thoughts on the Smallville scene in Superman the movie. Everything I love about Superman is encapsulated in his time in Smallville. When I watch Superman the movie I typically just watch from beginning up through Superman flying at the camera in the fortress after his training with Jor-El, and call it a wrap. That first half gives me everything I need and captures the essence of Superman, in a purity that no other Superman movie has since. The 108th Sage wrote, I just watched this with two friends who are Marvel fans, and I think I liked it the most. But we all both had problems with it and had fun with it when they went with the new 52 origin. I didn't realize my biggest problem with it would end up being, but I'm a goddess DSX hand waves. Ryan Daly wrote, to Illegal Machine's question of why did they even go to Egypt. I can only assume one of the writers remembered the line trouble in the Suez from we didn't start the fire and grasped at some vague recollection that Egypt was a hot spot in the 1980s. Gord Tolton wrote, because Max Lord was there to grab the crown from the world's oil king. Mac replied, I knew why Max Lord was there. I meant WW and Steve. It was only for the awful action sequence where he, kinda, reveals to Diana that he ate the stone. Derek returned for Uber nerd stuff. I mean, it was flimsy, but they did the whole garbage search which led them to Lord's flight path. The Oil King mentions Bialia, even though they also say Egypt for the uninitiated. Should have been its own country next to Syria Perdiciatlus.
The preceding program is a non-profit fan production. Any copyrighted materials contained therein are believed borrowed under fair use with no copyright infringement intended. Please feel free to leave comments at Rolled Spines Productions WordPress blog. You can also send us Twitter comments through the Rolled Spine Podcast Twitter. Thank you for listening.